At Starbound, we tell stories the human way, not with artificial voices or AI slop. In the end, what's HFY without humanity? Subscribe to keep it this way. My name's General G. Let's begin. The specific way blood stopped adhering to her claws told a Harridan bounty hunter that the job was finished. It was a subtle shift in surface tension, a change in viscosity as the vital fluid cooled and congealed. For Kyra Valen, it was the galaxy's most satisfying sensation. She drew a black keratin talon across a grimy bar rag, wiping the final crimson smear away. The air in the bar, a dive called the gutter, was a thick cocktail of odors: stale synth ale that smelled of fermented yeast and chemical sweeteners. It was a perfume she'd long ago come to associate with getting paid. A heavy sack of polymer-sheathed credit chits clinked on the scarred bar top, the sound a pleasant counterpoint to the low thrum of the cantina's struggling life support. "Pleasure doing business with you, Grum," she said. "You had it coming," the bartender gurgled, his bulbous, multi-jointed arm swiping the rag without a glance at the gore soaking it. His face, a collection of fleshy folds and small, glossy eyes, remained fixed on a flickering sports broadcast above the bar. "Tried to pass off diluted ion fuel as premium grade." "A crime against commerce," Kyra agreed, her tone laced with a theatrical solemnity. "And good taste." A stool scraped on the metal floor beside her, the squeak of worn synth leather, the clean, sharp smell of soldering flux that suggested recent work with delicate electronics, and a faint, almost imperceptible hint of something else she couldn't immediately place, something human. "A bottle of your best rot gut," a man's voice said. It was dry, laced with an undercurrent of amusement that felt entirely out of place in the gutter's atmosphere of weary resignation. "And a set of Series 9 plasma conduit schematics, if you have any that fell off a transport." Grum grunted, a sound like gravel turning in a cement mixer, and slid a dusty, unlabeled bottle across the bar. "Schematics will cost you." "Everything does." Kyra finally turned her head, her predatory eyes the color of molten gold, taking in the newcomer. He was human, lean in a way that spoke of a fast metabolism rather than hunger. Dark hair fell over his forehead as he leaned forward to inspect the bottle. Her gaze, however, snagged on his hands as they wrapped around the glass. They were clean. The fingers were long and deft, the nails trimmed, the skin smoothed. There were no scars, no calluses from blaster grips, no faint burn marks from misfired plasma cells. They were the hands of a man who paid others to handle his violence. A slow, deeply amused smirk spread across her lips. "Careful with that drink, soft hands," she purred, her voice dripping with a condescension she knew was as sharp as her claws. "Wouldn't want you to get a blister." The man paused, the bottle halfway to his glass. He turned his head slowly, and his eyes met hers. There was no offense in them, only a cool, analytical curiosity that was more unnerving than anger would have been. He glanced at her blood-flecked talons, then back at his own hands resting on the bar. "My hands break concepts," he retorted, his voice quiet but carrying a strange weight that seemed to push back against the surrounding noise. "A bit above your pay grade." Kyra's smirk widened into a grin, showing the tips of her fangs. Oh, this was fun. A desk jockey with a spine. "Concepts don't bleed," she shot back, her voice a low, teasing growl. "And they don't pay for this." She patted the bag of credits, making them jingle. "They do if you sell them to the right people," he said, pouring his drink with a steady hand. "And unlike your bounties, they don't stain the upholstery." Before Kyra could craft a suitably cutting reply, the entire west wall of the gutter vanished, in a deafening, pulverizing roar of shattered plasteel and powdered duracrete. A pressure wave slammed through the bar, snatching the air from lungs and flinging patrons from their seats. A thick cloud of gray dust and airborne debris billowed into the space, carrying the acrid stench of something burnt and deeply, fundamentally wrong. Screams erupted, a chaotic symphony of terror. While others dove for cover, Kyra felt a calm focus settle over her. Through the newly created doorway entered a beast of bioengineered horror. It moved on 6 powerful insectoid limbs, each tipped with a scythe-like talon that scraped deep grooves into the permacrete floor. Its body was a mass of corded, twitching muscle wrapped in overlapping plates of a dark, bone-like armor. Its head was a wedge of prehistoric anatomy, and a pair of serrated, beak-like jaws clicked and gnashed below a set of 4 soulless, pit-like eyes that seemed to absorb the light. A grave hound. Kyra had only ever seen them in black market spec sheets, listed with a price tag that could buy a small moon. Kyra reacted, her body uncoiled from the stool in a single fluid motion. A predator seeing not a threat but a challenge. A magnificent city-destroying challenge. "Finally," she said, a thrill arcing through her nerves like a live wire. "A real fight." She launched herself from the bar, her black claws extending. She landed on the creature's back, her talons seeking purchase, looking for a seam, a weak point, anything. Sparks flew as her claws, which could shred durasteel plating, screeched uselessly against the grave hound's bio-armor. It was like trying to scratch glass with a fingernail. The armor was flawless, a seamless shell of bio-organic perfection. The beast buckled, a low guttural roar vibrating through the room and shaking bottles from the shelves. The force was immense. It twisted its torso with sickening speed, and one of its secondary limbs, a blur of dark armor, swatted her out of the air like an annoying insect. Kyra hit the reinforced bar with a sickening crack that sent a starburst of agony through her ribs. She slid to the floor, the air knocked from her lungs, her vision swimming in a sea of black spots. The thrill of the fight evaporated, replaced by the cold, sharp shock of being utterly outmatched. She was strong, she was fast, she was one of the most feared hunters in the sector, and against this thing, she was nothing. She pushed herself up on one elbow, a defiant growl rumbling in her chest, just as the gravehound turned its attention to her. It loomed over her, its shadow a promise of oblivion. The huge wet jaws opened, ready to snap her in two. This, she thought, with a flicker of grim humor, was a hell of a way to go. The panicked screams, the crashing debris, the roar of the monster, it all faded into a muted background hum. For Charlie Ark, the surge of adrenaline wasn't just a biological reaction. It was a state of being where the universe became a schematic. The roaring monster wasn't an animal. It was a machine with stress points and design flaws. He saw Kyra on the floor, dazed but defiant, a splash of vibrant, fierce life about to be extinguished. Her death was an unacceptable outcome. His eyes scanned the battlefield. He saw discarded lengths of durasteel support beams from the shattered wall. Heavy, solid, perfect. He grabbed 2 of them, one in each hand. The gravehound wasn't an animal. It was a poorly designed weapons platform. Over-armored, over-muscled, but full of exploitable flaws. Its multi-jointed legs stomped down near Kyra. Charlie didn't see a leg, he saw a hinge, a complex system of levers and fulcrums. As it raised its leg for another step, he darted forward. He jammed the end of the first durasteel pipe deep into the primary joint, right behind its knee analog. The beast roared, a sound of pain and fury, and twisted, its massive head snapping toward him. Its serrated jaws gnashed, a pair of hydraulic shears, and right in the center, where the 2 halves of its lower jaw met, Charlie saw it, a seam. It was almost invisible, a fused suture line from its growth fat, an engineer's invitation. The maw opened wide to bite him in half, a fatal mistake. With his free hand, he shoved the second pipe into its mouth, perpendicular to its jaw, forcing it open. The pipe groaned under the immense pressure, steel screeching against the bone-like armor, but it held, a wedge driven into the core of the machine. The monster thrashed, its focus consumed by the metal rod in its mouth, trying to crush it. This gave Charlie the opening he needed. He let go of the wedged pipe, ducked under a thrashing limb, and snatched up the first pipe, the one he'd used on the leg. It was bent now, a perfect tool for his purpose. He moved back to the creature's head, ignoring the snapping jaws and the stench of its breath, a foul odor of raw meat and chemicals. He found the seam on its jaw again. He jammed the bent tip of the pipe into the thin fissure. It fit perfectly. The beast's own armored head became his fulcrum. The long durasteel pipe became his lever. He planted his feet, gripped the end of the pipe with both hands, and threw his entire body weight downward. The adrenaline gave him strength, but physics gave him power. A high-pitched screech of tearing bio-armor and snapping bone cut through the air. With an explosive final crack that echoed like a gunshot in the cantina, the lower jaw didn't just break. It fractured clean along the seam, splitting the apex predator's head in half. Black, viscous fluid sprayed across his face and chest. The gravehound stood frozen for a second, a statue of disbelief, its single upper jaw hanging uselessly. The pipe clattered to the floor. Then, with a final, shuddering sigh, the great machine of flesh collapsed. It crashed to the floor, its death tremor shaking the entire building. Silence descended, thick and absolute. The only sound was Charlie's own breathing, coming in ragged, desperate gasps. He stood over the corpse, looking at his own hands. They were covered in gore, bruised, the knuckles split and bleeding. They shook violently as the adrenaline receded, leaving a deep, aching exhaustion in its wake. A wave of nausea and a strange, grim satisfaction washed over him in equal measure. Kyra pushed herself to her feet, her ribs screaming in protest. The ringing in her ears subsided, replaced by the profound, echoing quiet. She stared, her mind struggling to process what it had just witnessed. Her eyes fixed on his hands, the same hands she had mocked moments before. Now they were bruised, bloody, and trembling, but they were the hands that had just saved her life. The contempt she'd felt for him, the easy dismissal, it all evaporated. In its place, something else bloomed, something hot, primal, and utterly confusing. A flush of heat spread through her body, originating deep in her chest. Her breath caught, and a low, involuntary purr rumbled in her throat, a sound she hadn't made since her first hunt. Strength was the only currency that mattered in her world, and she had just witnessed a king's ransom. She walked toward him, her usual confident swagger replaced by a slow, deliberate stride. Her eyes traced the lines of his body, seeing not a soft desk jockey, but a coiled predator hiding in plain sight. As she drew near the twitching corpse, a small, rhythmic blinking caught her eye. It came from a piece of tech half buried in the gore near the beast's severed neck stump. A small metallic plate, dislodged in the final violent trauma. It was a biometric control unit, its status light flashing a frantic red error code, and stamped neatly onto its casing was a logo she knew all too well, a stylized double helix in a circle, Omnigen. Her gaze snapped from the logo back to Charlie. He was still staring at his hands, as if he didn't recognize them. She stopped in front of him, close enough to feel the heat coming off his skin, close enough to smell the copper tang of blood and the electric scent of his exertion. She reached out, not to touch him, but to point a single sharp claw at the bloody fists hanging at his sides. "Okay," she purred, her voice a low, husky growl that was for him and him alone. Maybe soft hands wasn't the right description. Charlie's workshop wasn't a room, it was a physical manifestation of his thought process. To an outsider, it was a mess. Hollow projectors hung from the ceiling on jury-rigged power cables. displaying half-finished schematics of engines and weapon systems that shimmered in the air like ghostly blueprints. Workbenches overflowed with dismantled data pads, gleaming power cells, and tools so specialized they looked like surgical instruments. Laser calipers, micro-soldering filaments, atomic force probes. The air smelled of hot metal, the sharp scent of soldering flux, and the faint, sweet scent of caffeinated nutrient paste. But it was a system. Tools lay scattered, but within arm's reach of their relevant projects. Every object was exactly where it was supposed to be. He sat at his central console, the damaged Omnigen control unit connected by a delicate spider web of microprobes. His hands, now cleaned and bandaged, moved with a speed that her eyes could not comfortably track over the holographic interface. He was coaxing the dead to speak, teasing streams of corrupted data from the fried circuits. He was aware of Kyra behind him. He could feel her presence like a change in the air pressure. She wasn't sitting, wasn't standing still. She was prowling. She paced the length of his workshop like a caged panther, her movements fluid and silent on the balls of her feet. He could feel her eyes on him, on his hands. Every few minutes, she'd stop and pick something up. A hyperspanner calibrated to a 10,000th of a millimeter. A deactivated singularity grenade he used as a paperweight. She turned it over in her clawed hands, her expression a mixture of intense curiosity and something else he couldn't quite decipher. He knew what she was doing. She was trying to reconcile two irreconcilable images. The man whose hands could delicately rewire a Neuralink, and the man whose hands could leverage a ton of Durasteel to shatter engineered bone. The creator and the destroyer. He couldn't blame her. He was having a hard time reconciling them himself. "It's fighting me," he said, breaking the silence. His voice was steady, focused. "The data core is flash-fried, and the whole thing is trapped behind a nasty piece of corporate black ice. It's almost elegant in its bastardry." Kyra stopped her pacing directly behind his chair. "Can you break it?" "I'm not trying to break it," he murmured, his fingers dancing across the holokeys, coaxing a green-lit diagnostic to life. "I'm convincing it to open the door for me. Breaking things is loud, inefficient." He glanced back at her, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Usually." Her answering grin was sharp and predatory. "I'm beginning to see the appeal of inefficiency. That lever trick, that was new. Not the kind of thing they teach in engineering school, I take it." "Applied physics," he said, a flicker of the earlier cold clarity in his eyes. "Every problem is a physics problem." He leaned back, the chair groaning in protest as he finally broke through the primary encryption layer. A data schematic bloomed in the air between them, a three-dimensional map of a sector of neon Elysium. A single building was highlighted in red. "Got it. The unit was a remote command interface, slave to a central server. It was monitoring the beast's vitals and combat performance. And that server is located right here. Omnigen Applied Sciences Division. A black site lab hidden in plain sight in the industrial district." "A lab," Kyra said, her golden eyes gleaming, "which means there might be more of them." "Worse," Charlie said, his expression hardening as a new file decrypted. It was a project manifest, codenamed Gravehound. He pointed to a line item. "Live field test and asset demonstration scheduled." They weren't just testing it, they were showing it off. He dug deeper, bypassing another security layer. A subfolder appeared labeled Client and Objective, and the target wasn't random. The gutter is in a territory controlled by AetherCorp, their biggest rival in the biotech market. This wasn't just a sales pitch, it was a hostile, deniable attack. Create chaos, prove their product works in a real-world environment, and tank their competitor's stock, all in one shot. Kyra's expression turned to cold fury. She'd been a pawn in a corporate war game, an obstacle to be swatted aside. Her pride, her very existence, had been deemed irrelevant. "They wanted a demonstration," she growled, her claws flexing instinctively, scoring faint lines on the arm of his chair. "Let's give them one." "So, what's the plan?" Kyra asked. She was perched on a stack of power converters, sharpening the edge of one of her claws on a diamond file with slow, deliberate strokes. The rasping sound filled the brief silences between their words. "We walk in the front door and you politely ask them to stop building monsters? Or do you just want to find another lever and topple the whole building?" Charlie didn't look up from the complex schematic he was studying, a blueprint of the Omnigen facility he'd pulled from the city's public works archive. "Patience, Predator," he retorted, his tone dry. "Not every problem has a spine to sever." "A pity," she purred. "It's such a simple solution." "Simple is messy. I prefer elegant." He magnified a section of the schematic showing the building's ventilation system. "Their primary security is formidable. Biometric scanners, pressure plates, armed guard, patrols. The front door is a death trap." "So, a back door?" "A side door." He traced a line with his finger. "The main server room is cooled by an industrial thermal exhaust port. The vent is 3 feet wide and empties into a maintenance corridor on the sub-level. The corridor is on a different security grid, an older one. I can spoof the access codes for that. The vent itself is protected by a magnetic sealed fan blade, but the control mechanism is rudimentary. I can bypass it." Kyra hopped down from her perch, landing with the silence of a falling leaf. She leaned over his shoulder, studying the plans. Her scent, a clean, musky aroma unique to her species, filled his senses. He steadfastly ignored the way his heart rate picked up. "It's a tight squeeze," she noted. "We'll manage." "And once we're in, what do we do? Steal their data? Blow the place up?" "Blowing it up is still messy," he said, a flicker of something dangerous in his eyes. "I have a better idea. I'm gonna plant a logic bomb." She raised an eyebrow. "Sounds explosive." "It's not. It's quiet. A logic bomb is a piece of code that lies dormant until a specific condition is met. I'm going to bury it in their central server's core programming. It won't do any damage. It will do one thing and one thing only. It will trigger a single, high-level silent alarm, a Class 1 diagnostic anomaly, the kind of thing that doesn't summon guards, but it does summon the person in charge directly to their personal terminal." Kyra's eyes lit up with understanding. "You're not trying to steal their secrets. You're ringing the doorbell for the head vampire." "Exactly," Charlie said, a thin, wolfish smile on his face. "I want to know who's holding the leash, and I want them to know we were there. I want them to know we could have burned them to the ground, but chose not to. Fear is a much more effective weapon than data." She stared at him, at the quiet, calculating intensity of his face. The man was a whirlwind of contradictions. A pacifist who wielded violence with a frightening level of competence. A thinker who could unleash something utterly primal. Her fascination with him was rapidly becoming an obsession. "All right, soft hands," she said, the name no longer an insult but a playful, intimate jab. "Let's go ring a doorbell." The air in the maintenance corridor was cold and damp, thick with the smell of recycled air and the metallic scent of mildew. A constant low hum vibrated through the grated floor. Neon Elysium's perpetual rain streaked the grimy window at the far end of the hall, casting long, distorted shadows that danced like ghosts. They had slipped through the sub-level access point without a hitch, Charlie's custom-coded data spike making a mockery of the aging security system. They moved in silence, a study in contrasts. Kyra was a shadow, her body flowing through the darkness, her senses on high alert, tasting the air, listening for the faintest sound. Charlie was deliberate, his steps measured, his eyes constantly scanning, not for threats but for systems. He saw the corridor as a flowchart of power conduits, data ports, and structural supports. "Patrol," Kyra whispered, her voice barely a breath. Charlie saw them a second later, not directly, but as distorted figures in the reflection of the wet floor ahead. 2 armored guards, pulse rifles held at the ready, rounding the corner. There was no time to think, only to react. Kyra grabbed the front of Charlie's jacket and hauled him backward, pulling them both into a tiny, cramped maintenance closet. She slammed the door shut just as the heavy tread of the guard's boots echoed past. The closet was pitch black and smelled of dust and metallic decay. It was barely big enough for one person, let alone 2. They were pressed together, body to body, an intimacy born of necessity. Charlie's back was flat against the cold metal wall. Kyra was a wall of heat and coiled muscle in front of him. Her hands braced on either side of his head. He could feel the steady, powerful rhythm of her heart against his chest. Or maybe it was his own. He couldn't tell them apart. He could feel the warmth radiating from her skin through the thin fabric of his shirt. Her breath hitched, warm against his cheek. In the suffocating darkness, every small sensation was magnified. The soft brush of her hip against his, the solid strength in her frame, the subtle scent of her skin. The air grew thick, charged with something far more dangerous than the armed guards just outside the door. "They're gone," he whispered, his voice huskier than he intended. "I know," she whispered back, but she didn't move. He could feel the tension in her body, a thrumming energy that mirrored the frantic pulse in his own veins. This was a different kind of adrenaline, not the cold, clear focus of the fight, but a hot, chaotic surge that clouded his thoughts. He could feel a low vibration in her chest, a sound he was beginning to recognize. She was purring. The moment stretched, suspended in the darkness. It was terrifying and exhilarating. The world had shrunk to the space between them, to the feel of her body pressed against his. The patrol might as well have been on another planet. Finally, with a soft sigh that sounded like it was torn from her, she pushed away, opening the door a crack. The dim light of the corridor sliced into their sanctuary. "Coast is clear," she said, her voice strained. They stepped back out into the corridor, the spell broken. But the charge, the silent, crackling energy between them, was left hanging in the air, an unspoken promise. The server room was a cathedral of cold blue light. Racks of humming machinery stood in neat, silent rows, their status lights blinking in a hypnotic rhythm. A massive holographic display dominated the far wall, showing cascading streams of data, the lifeblood of Omnigen's secret operations. It was clean, sterile, and soulless. "Charming place," Kyra muttered, her claws retracted but her posture radiating readiness. "Makes you feel all warm and fuzzy inside." Charlie didn't reply. He was already moving toward the central console, his eyes scanning the architecture of the system. "They're arrogant," he said, his fingers a blur as he jacked in his data spike. "Their external security is top tier, but their internal network is sloppy. They never expected anyone to get this far." While he worked, Kyra did a slow, silent sweep of the lab beyond the server room. What she saw made her stomach tighten. It was a factory of horrors. Rows of large, reinforced cages lined the walls. Most were empty, but 3 held more gravehounds. They were dormant, lying in a low-power, stasis-like state, but their sheer presence was a violation of the natural order. Vats of bubbling, nutrient-rich, amniotic fluid held half-formed monstrosities, things that were all teeth and claws and twitching muscle. This wasn't science. This was desecration. She returned to the server room as Charlie was pulling back from the console. "It's done," he said, his face grim. "The logic bomb is in place, buried so deep they won't find it until the boss gets a little notification that says, 'System anomaly, core kernel.' By then, we'll be long gone." "Good," Kyra said, the single word laced with venom. "Let's burn this place to the ground." "Not yet," Charlie said, his attention caught by a terminal near the console. It was logged in, left open by a careless technician. Curiosity is a powerful motivator. He quickly accessed the directory. Most of it was encrypted, but he found a few project folders that were unsecured. He opened one. His face went pale. "What is it?" Kyra asked, moving to his side. On the screen were plans, detailed, horrific plans. It was the full scope of the plot they'd glimpsed before. The live fire market correction, designed to annihilate the Athercorp warehouse district on the far side of the city. They were going to unleash a pack of these things. Then he found the other file. It was a research folder labeled Project Hysteria, Human Adrenaline Surge Synthesis. It was full of data, grainy videos of humans in high-stress situations performing feats that should not have been possible. A mother lifting a ground car off her child. A dock worker holding up a collapsing cargo container. And then a new entry, flagged for priority analysis. It was security footage from the gutter, from multiple angles. It showed Charlie. It showed him analyzing the Gravehound, jamming the pipes into its joints, the application of force. There were biometric readings overlaid on the video, extrapolated from the footage. Heart rate, adrenaline levels, estimated force output in newtons, and all of it off the charts. He was no longer just an obstacle. He was the prize. They weren't just studying the phenomenon, Charlie said, his voice dangerously quiet. They were trying to replicate it, to bottle it, to turn that part of us into another product to be sold. He looked at Kyra, his gray eyes like chips of ice. And I just gave them the best data they've ever had. An alarm suddenly blared, a shrill, piercing shriek. Not the silent one Charlie had planted. This was the real thing. A proximity alert from the terminal he was using. "Time to go," Kyra snapped, grabbing his arm. "Now!" They sprinted from the lab, the sounds of shouting guards and slamming blast doors echoing behind them. The escape was a blur of motion and adrenaline. They crashed through a fire door, sprinted down a loading bay, and dove into the labyrinthine alleys of the industrial district just as Omnigen security vehicles swarmed the building. Rain slicked the pavement, turning the neon signs into watery, bleeding smears of color. They didn't stop running until their lungs burned and the sounds of pursuit had faded behind them. They found refuge in the first place that looked like it wouldn't ask questions. A grimy, automated hotel where you paid in untraceable credits, and the room smelled of damp synth fabric and regret. The room was small, a box with a bed, a flickering light panel, and a window that looked out onto a rain-lashed neon sign advertising something called Soylent Noodles. The moment the door hissed shut, the combined weight of the run, the fight, and the sheer raw intensity of the last few hours crashed over them. They stood in the middle of the cramped room, breathing heavily, soaked from the rain, the silence stretching between them thick with unspoken words and unresolved tension. Charlie ran a hand through his wet hair, his body still thrumming with leftover energy. He looked at Kyra. Her face was flushed, her eyes bright and wild. The carefully constructed walls they had both built around themselves had been shattered. The tension finally snapped. It was Kyra who moved first. She crossed the short distance between them in 2 long strides and slammed him back against the wall. The impact knocked the air from his lungs. She caged him in, her hands planting firmly on the wall on either side of his head, her body pressing his against the cool surface. Her eyes, gold and feral in the dim light, burned into his. "That little trick in the closet?" she growled, her voice a low, husky rumble. "That was you holding back." It wasn't a question. "I'm an engineer," he managed to get out, his voice strained. "We value control." "Show me," she commanded, her voice dropping to a whisper that was more potent than any shout. "Show me what those hands can do when they're not breaking things." His control shattered. He wrapped his arms around her, his hands tangling in her damp, dark hair, and pulled her mouth to his. The kiss was explosive, a desperate, hungry collision. It wasn't gentle or tender, it was a release. It was the culmination of mockery and respect, of violence and fascination, of 2 predators recognizing each other. Her claws, which could tear through steel, were surprisingly gentle as they traced the lines of his back, sending shivers down his spine. His hands, the ones she had called soft, were anything but. They were strong, firm, mapping the powerful curves of her body, learning her shape with an engineer's focus and a lover's urgency. He lifted her effortlessly, and she wrapped her legs around his waist as he carried her the few steps to the bed. They fell onto the thin mattress in a tangle of limbs and damp clothes. The ensuing moments were a raw, passionate storm, a desperate communication more honest than words. It was about touch, about the shocking contrast of his strength and her ferocity. He discovered the sensitive spot behind her feline ears, and she discovered the way his breath hitched when her claws scraped lightly across his chest. It was a frantic exploration, a mapping of scars and strengths. His hands, which had wrought such brutal destruction, were now instruments of exquisite pleasure, gentle and demanding all at once. Her power, which she had always used to dominate and intimidate, was now a shared current arcing between them. In the grimy neon-lit hotel room, surrounded by the sins of Neon Elysium, the creator and the destroyer found a new, breathtaking application for their skills. Kyra woke to the gentle, rhythmic tapping of rain against the window pane. The neon glow from outside painted the room in hues of pink and blue. She was tangled in the thin sheets with Charlie, his arm draped possessively over her waist, his breathing a slow, steady presence beside her. The chaotic energy of the previous night had settled into a quiet, humming intimacy. She felt calm. It was a foreign, unsettling, and deeply pleasant sensation. In her life, stillness had always been a prelude to violence. This was different. This was peace. She shifted slightly, turning to face him. He was still asleep, his face relaxed, the usual tension gone from his brow. The sarcastic, analytical engineer looked almost boyish. She found herself watching the slow rise and fall of his chest, a strange warmth blooming in her own. Her gaze fell to his hand, resting on the sheet between them. She reached out, her own hand covering his. His fingers were long and graceful, but now she could see the raw, bruised knuckles, the faint lines of scarring from a life spent with tools and tech that she hadn't noticed before. This hand had rebuilt a particle injector for her souped-up skimmer 3 years ago, a job so complex no one else would touch it. This hand had typed the code that had made Omnigen's security a joke. This hand had leveraged physics to break a monster, and this hand had touched her with a tenderness that had left her breathless. She gently caught his hand, turning it over to examine the palm. It wasn't soft. It was strong, calloused in ways that spoke of work, not fighting. His eyes opened, gray and clear, and met hers. He didn't seem surprised to find her studying him. A faint smile touched his lips. "Something wrong?" he asked, his voice rough with sleep. "Creation and destruction," she murmured, tracing the lines of his palm with the tip of a claw. "I'm still trying to figure out how they fit in the same person, in the same hands." He met her gaze, his expression serious now. The smile was gone, replaced by a quiet intensity that she was beginning to crave. "They're the same thing," he said, his voice low. "Just different applications of force. You just have to know where the weak points are." He shifted, propping himself up on an elbow. "Every system, whether it's a machine, a corporation, or a person, has them. Points of stress, points of leverage. Find them, and you can either reinforce them or you can break them completely." His words resonated with her, a philosophy so simple and yet so profound, it clicked into place with her own predatory worldview. She saw her targets as prey. She saw them as systems to be dismantled. The end result was the same. They were two sides of the same lethal coin. This cemented it. This connection that had sparked in violence and ignited in passion was now tempered into something stronger, something real. "Omnigen tried to buy out my father's shipping guild on Cathar," she said, the words coming out before she'd even decided to speak them. "He refused. A week later, his primary fighter suffered a catastrophic engine failure in a high-traffic lane. The inquiry blamed faulty parts. My father was ruined. I knew better. Charlie's hand tightened on hers. A Vask-owned tech conglomerate pushed my family off our asteroid mining claim, he said. His voice was flat. They used legal loopholes the size of a gas giant, said our independent operation was environmentally unstable. They strip-mined it in 6 months and left a dead rock behind. I was 15. They looked at each other, the shared history of corporate ruthlessness hanging between them. Their fight with Omnigen wasn't just about a monster in a bar anymore. It wasn't about revenge or profit. It was a cause. It was a reckoning. The comfortable silence that followed was broken by a soft, polite chime. A pinprick of light appeared in the center of the room, expanding rapidly into a three-dimensional holographic projection. Standing there, rendered in shimmering blue light, was a Vask. He was tall and sleek, dressed in a severe, high-collared corporate uniform. His skin was the color of polished slate, and his 4 black, unblinking eyes fixed on them with an unnerving lack of emotion. "Charlie Ark, Kyra Villain," the hologram said, his voice calm, measured, and dripping with condescension. "I am Director Torvax. I trust you slept well. My apologies for the intrusion." Charlie felt a cold knot tighten in his gut, but his face remained a mask of calm indifference. He sat up, pulling the sheet up with him to cover his waist, a reflexive, pointless gesture of modesty in the face of absolute surveillance. Torvax's four-eyed gaze seemed to peel back the layers of the room, of their lives, seeing everything. "Director," Charlie said, his voice deceptively casual, "to what do we owe the pleasure? Run out of monsters to let off the leash?" Torvax's thin lips didn't even twitch. There was no anger, no surprise, just the placid arrogance of a god observing insects. "Your work in my laboratory was impressive. Crude, but effective. You have something of mine, a small piece of code currently residing on my central server, a clever little tripwire." "Finders keepers," Kyra growled from beside Charlie, her body tensed like a loaded spring. "Indeed," Torvax continued, his gaze shifting to her for a fraction of a second, before dismissing her entirely and focusing back on Charlie. "But you are the far more interesting asset. The data from your outburst in the cantina is a gold mine. The physiological reaction is purer than anything we've managed to synthesize. A genuine struggle provides the most valuable data." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "I don't just want you dead. That would be a waste of a unique specimen. I want to test you. I have a new unit, an Alpha, superior in every way. Stronger, faster, smarter. I want to see how you fare against it." "And if we decline your generous offer?" Charlie asked, his mind already racing, calculating angles, running scenarios. "A fair question," Torvax said, his voice retaining its infuriatingly calm corporate tone. "When you planted your logic bomb, you inadvertently bypassed a containment procedure on the other Gravehound units, a failsafe. If I do not reset it from my command terminal within the next 90 minutes, they will default to their last programmed directive, which, as you know, is to sterilize the EtherCorp warehouse district. Thousands of civilian lives are housed in the tenements bordering that district. A tragedy, but a necessary expense for progress." He was lying. Charlie knew it instantly. The failsafe was a fabrication, a bluff. But it was a bluff he couldn't call. The risk, however small, was too great. "Omnigen Tower, rooftop landing facility, 1 hour," Torvax stated. "Please, bring your best. The data will be invaluable. Don't be late." The hologram flickered and dissolved, leaving them once again in the quiet, neon-lit room. The peace was shattered, replaced by the cold certainty of a final confrontation. Charlie looked at Kyra. The playful sarcasm was gone, replaced by a shared grim determination. "He wants a demonstration," Charlie said. Kyra's answering smile was all teeth. Then let's give him a goddamn show." They didn't talk on the way back to the workshop. There was nothing left to say. The plan was already forming in the space between them, a silent, intuitive understanding. The moment the workshop door hissed open, they moved with a frantic, focused energy. There was no soaring musical score, only the sounds of desperate, brilliant improvisation. "He gave us an hour to get there, but 90 minutes until his failsafe goes off," Kyra said, stripping off her jacket and heading straight for her own locker of gear. "Why the gap?" "He's arrogant," Charlie replied, already at his main console, his fingers a blur across the holographic interface. "He's giving himself a 30-minute buffer to watch us die and still have time to heroically stop the attack. It's not a failsafe, it's a timer, and he just gave me its exact length." He wasn't trying to hack Omnigen anymore. He was doing something far more audacious. He activated his logic bomb, not to trigger the alarm, but to execute a new command. The code was a ghost, silently copying every damning file on Omnigen's servers. The Gravehound Project, Project Hysteria, the plans for the rival syndicate attack, Torvax's private logs, and encrypting them into a single massive data packet. "What are you doing?" Kyra asked, pulling a series of wicked-looking Harridan fighting blades from their sheaths and checking their edges. "Buying insurance," Charlie said, his voice tight with concentration. He began routing the encrypted packet. "I'm sending this into the labyrinth." "The what?" "A decentralized ghost network I built years ago from the digital husks of failed corporations and abandoned deep space relays. It doesn't exist in any one place. It's a web of echoes, untraceable, unstoppable. I'm attaching this packet to a dead man's switch. 90 minutes from now," he hit a final key, "if I don't input a specific kill code, the labyrinth decrypts the packet and distributes it to every public news network, corporate watchdog, and law enforcement server in the known galaxy. Omnigen's stock will be worthless before the market opens tomorrow." Kyra let out a low whistle. "Soft hands, you are a magnificent bastard." "I try." Now he needed a weapon. A pulse rifle was too impersonal, a blaster too crude. His eyes scanned the chaotic landscape of his workshop and landed on an industrial pneumatic riveting gun. It was a heavy, ugly tool designed to fire hardened Durasteel bolts into a ship's hull. He grabbed it, hauling it onto his workbench. He began to strip it down, tearing off safety limiters and governors with a furious energy. He bypassed the compressed air system, jury-rigging a direct feed from a volatile, experimental capacitor he'd been working on. Sparks flew as he soldered new connections, his hands a blur of motion. He was violating every design principle he held dear, turning a tool of precise construction into an instrument of pure kinetic chaos. It felt like blasphemy. It felt good. He was forging a tool of creation into a weapon of pure kinetic destruction. He wasn't just building a gun, he was building a gauntlet, a way to deliver a physical message. While he worked, Kyra moved through her own ritual. She sharpened her claws on a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape a counterpoint to Charlie's frantic soldering. She stretched, her body flowing through a series of deadly dance-like katas. She was honing her body, her instincts, her own biological weapons for the coming storm. Charlie finished his work with moments to spare. The riveting gun was now an overamped, monstrous gauntlet that encased his right hand and forearm. The capacitor, on its back, hummed with barely contained power. He stood up, flexing his fingers inside the new weapon. It felt heavy, it felt powerful. He looked at Kyra. She had finished her preparations and was watching him, her golden eyes glowing with fierce pride and anticipation. "Ready?" he asked. She gave him a devastatingly confident grin. "I was born ready. Try to keep up." The rooftop of Omnigen Tower was a landscape of glass, chrome, and gale force winds. Rain lashed down, driven sideways, making the distant neon lights of the city blur into a chaotic watercolor painting. The circular landing pad was slick and treacherous, a dueling ground 1,000 feet above the streets. Director Torvac stood waiting for them near the center, flanked by a dozen elite corporate security guards in full combat armor. He was protected from the deluge by a personal energy shield that caused the air around him to waver, repelling the rain. He looked as calm and unruffled as he had in the hologram. And beside him, crouched and waiting, was the Alpha. It was bigger than the one from the cantina, sleeker. Its armor plating was a darker, matte black that seemed to drink the light, and its limbs were longer, tipped with obsidian-sharp talons. It watched them with 4 malevolent, glowing red eyes, a low predatory rumble vibrating from its chest. "Punctual," Torvac observed, his voice amplified by his shield. "I appreciate that in a test subject." "We're on a tight schedule," Charlie called back over the wind, his voice steady. He and Kyra stood shoulder to shoulder at the edge of the landing pad, a united front against the storm. "You've got a city to not destroy, remember?" He subtly scanned the rooftop. Guards, Alpha, Torvac, check. He also saw power conduits for the landing lights, structural supports for the massive Omnigen sign, and a series of exhaust fans for the tower's climate control, a system with weak points. "They've got 2 guards on the east access walkway," Kyra said, her voice a low murmur only he could hear. "Overconfident. Think the height is enough protection. I want you to drop the landing lights on them in 3 seconds. I'll handle the mess. Think you can manage soft hands?" Charlie grinned, the rain plastering his hair to his forehead. He discreetly tapped a command into the datapad on his left wrist, rerouting a massive surge of power. Already done. As if on cue, the bank of landing lights on the east side of the datapad exploded in a shower of sparks and shattered glass, plunging that sector into darkness. Kyra was already moving before the first shard hit the ground, a black-clad blur that vanished into the newly created shadows. 2 strangled cries were abruptly cut off. Torvac's placid expression finally showed a flicker of annoyance. "Impressive teamwork. Begin the trial." He gave a curt nod. The guards opened fire, streams of red plasma lancing through the rain. The Alpha let out a deafening shriek and charged. The fight exploded. Charlie and Kyra moved as one. He laid down suppressing fire with his kinetic gauntlet, not firing rivets, but concussive blasts of pure force that sent guards stumbling. He became the anchor, the distraction, while Kyra became the storm. She met the guards head-on, a whirlwind of claws and blades. She was magnificent, a primal force of nature unleashed. She used their numbers against them, ducking under one man's fire so it hit his squadmate, using another as a springboard to launch herself at a third. This was not a fight, it was a harvest. Charlie provided cover, his engineer's mind tracking trajectories, predicting movements. He fired a kinetic blast at the base of a communications array, causing it to topple and scatter another group of guards. He and Kyra didn't need to speak. They moved in perfect sync, anticipating each other's actions, a seamless unit of brains and brawn, of technology and instinct. The rank-and-file guards were a nuisance, an appetizer. The main course was the Alpha, and it was Kyra's dance. She broke away from the last of the security team, leaving them groaning and disarmed, and met the Alpha's charge in the center of the rooftop. The beast was faster than its predecessor, its movements smarter, more calculated. It didn't just attack, it herded, trying to back her toward the edge of the roof. But Kyra was its equal in speed and far superior in cunning. She used its momentum against it, letting it lunge past her, her claws raking deep gouges in its side. The armor was stronger, but not flawless. While Kyra battled the monster, Charlie strode directly toward Director Torvac. The remaining guards hesitated, unsure whether to engage him or help with the Alpha. Torvac watched Charlie approach, his 4 black eyes unblinking. "Your resistance is futile, human. It only serves to provide me with more data. The demonstration is about to begin." Charlie stopped just outside the range of Torvax's personal shield. He glanced at the chrono on his wrist. 10 minutes left on the dead man's switch. "You're right," Charlie said, his voice cutting through the wind. "Mine is." He held up his datapad, the screen showing the data packet's countdown timer. "In 10 minutes, your entire bioweapons program, your illegal research, your plans for corporate terrorism, all of it goes public. Everything, unless I stop it." For the first time, Director Torvax's placid corporate mask cracked. A flicker of genuine shock, no, of fear, flashed in his 4 eyes. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Charlie asked. He raised his kinetic gauntlet. It hummed with contained power. Torvax frantically tapped at a command panel on his own wrist, trying to sever Charlie's connection, to lock down his servers, but it was too late. The data was already gone, a ghost in a machine he couldn't touch. "It's over, Torvax," Charlie said. He took a final step forward. "Your risk-reward analysis was poor." He punched. The kinetic gauntlet unleashed its stored energy in a single devastating blast. It didn't just break Torvax's personal shield, it shattered it. The punch connected squarely with the Vask's chest, lifting him off his feet and sending him flying backward. He crashed through the reinforced plasteel wall of the tower's rooftop lounge, leaving a man-shaped hole in the glass. He came to a stop halfway through, dangling precariously over a 1,000-foot drop, held in place only by shards of broken frame. At that exact moment, Kyra finished her own fight. She ducked under a wild swipe from the Alpha, slid between its legs, and came up behind it. With a final ferocious roar, she drove her claws deep into the back of its neck, finding the junction where the cybernetic controls met the spinal column, and severed the connection. The Alpha collapsed, twitching once before going still. Kyra turned, breathing heavily, and saw Torvax dangling from the side of the tower. She looked at Charlie, who stood with his gauntlet still smoking slightly, and gave him a slow, appreciative grin. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. The city enforcers, likely alerted by Torvax's own panicked security, were on their way. "I think that's our cue," Kyra said, wiping black fluid from her claws. Charlie nodded, the adrenaline beginning to fade, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and a soaring sense of victory. "My bike is in the sub-level garage." They didn't take the elevator. They rappelled down the side of the building, using a spool of high-tensile cable from a maintenance locker, landing in a darkened alley 3 levels down. They reached the sub-level garage just as the entire tower went into full lockdown, klaxons blaring and heavy blast doors slamming shut. They got to Charlie's souped-up hoverbike just as a sleek, armored Enforcer patrol vehicle swooped down the entrance ramp, its searchlight pinning them and its weapons ports opening. Their escape was cut off. "Change of plans!" Charlie yelled, hopping onto the bike. Kyra swung on behind him without hesitation. "I'm starting to like your plans." Instead of heading for the blocked exit, Charlie gunned the engine and shot deeper into the parking garage. The Enforcer vehicle roared after them. Charlie weaved the bike between support pillars at speeds that defied physics, the scrape of their pursuer's armor against concrete echoing behind them. "Create a distraction!" he shouted. Kyra needed no further instruction. As they shot past a stack of unsecured cargo containers, she leaped out, one of her Harridan blades flashing in her hand. She sliced through a thick chain holding the stack in place. A ton of Durasteel crates crashed to the floor directly in the Enforcer vehicle's path. The sound of the impact was immense. It bought them the seconds they needed. Charlie spotted a section of the far wall made of cheaper, prefabricated Duracrete, a service entrance that had been sealed over. He angled the bike toward it, shunting all power to the forward deflectors. "Hold on!" They hit the wall with a thunderous crash, blasting through it in a cloud of dust and debris and out into the open air, 500 feet above the street below. The bike wobbled for a terrifying second before Charlie stabilized it, pulling them into a steep dive. Below, the sky was filled with the flashing lights of more Enforcer ships, all of them converging on the Omnigen Tower. Looking up, they could see the brilliant white spotlights pinning the dangling, humiliated form of Director Torvax against the side of his own monument to corporate greed. Charlie leveled out the bike, weaving into the neon canyons of the city. They were bruised, exhausted, and grinning like fools. The wind whipped past them, carrying the scent of rain and freedom. The entire glittering expanse of neon Elysium spread out before them, a city of endless possibilities. Kyra rested her head against Charlie's back, feeling the steady thrum of the bike's engine and the solid strength in his frame. She yelled to be heard over the wind, her voice full of laughter and thrill. "Where to next, soft hands?" Charlie just laughed, a real, unrestrained sound of pure joy. He reached back, his gauntleted hand covering hers, and squeezed. He tilted his head back, his lips finding her cheek in a quick, wind-whipped kiss, as they sped toward the glittering upper spires of the city. A new, thrilling, and gloriously uncertain road opening up before them.